Thank you. Yes, I am a pastor. Yes, I love the ancient Hebrew roots. Yes, I'm a developer and server architecture. But the thing that really matters the most to me is the communication of the gospel. But how many of y'all know the gospel is relevant to every area of our life? And we've got to have some understanding today. So I'm going to do the same thing I did previously. I'm going to mix together spiritual, biblical, and then technical, practical, political. It's a hodgepodge. So we're talking about secure communications and the battle for your worship. All right. Last year, when former President Donald Trump, it pains me to say former, filed a lawsuit against BigTech, he said this. He said, if they can do it to me, they can do it to anyone. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening. The left promptly feigned outrage at the mere mention that social media companies might be coordinating with the Biden administration. But then days later, the then White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, she admitted to the American people in the White House briefing room that President Biden and his administration were working with big tech giants on, quote, robust enforcement, end quote, of their platform speech. She said it out loud. Now, the threat to free speech posed by big tech censorship is all too real. Now, it used to be the case that your radical or your non-radical leftist messages would just be ignored by the media, relegated to your subculture and to late night talk show monologues. That used to be the case. But since Trump shocked the world in November 2016, big tech has gone on the offensive. Unfortunately, the following are just 3 examples of the most egregious forms of coordinated tech censorship and data tracking. Number 1, Hunter Biden's laptop, the big guy. In October 2020, the New York Post released a bombshell report. It revealed emails that Biden the Younger's laptop contained evidence that candidate Biden used his vice presidential influence in the Obama administration to curry favor with Ukrainian state-run oil company Burisma. Very simply, that's strong evidence of pay to play. Twitter and Facebook censored it on their platforms, citing their policy of not sharing illegally obtained information. Strangely, that didn't apply to Trump's tax returns. But after the election, even the New York Times was forced to report this as fact. Okay, it's not right-wing conspiracy, it's fact. It's what's in there. So it's not fake news, it's coordinated big tech censorship. This single act of censorship did more than any other suppression to deliver the presidency to Biden. You know, that and a few voter machine irregularities. So number 2, we know these, right? But we're gonna talk about them because the second biggest thing was all of the major social media companies deplatformed and banned Donald Trump. Facebook and Twitter have now permanently banned him. And many people think that some people took out Parler just to keep Trump from moving over and continuing his influence. So far, our new tech savior, Lord Elon, has still not been able to get Trump back on the platform. But I think it's interesting, as we're talking about Elon, that Twitter now sued him to force him to buy the company, which is going to put the very thing that Musk was after on the record, which is the exposure of the full scope of the bot problem in Twitter. We may yet see behind the Twitter algorithmic curtain. Maybe, there's a cynic in the front row. I don't know why you guys are cynical. I was the vice president of the marketing company that did all of Trump's data work in 2016 in San Antonio, Texas. And I can assure you from experience that the 2021 Facebook ban was the end of a long history of shadow banning and rate limiting. The third one, how many of y'all seen 2,000 Mules? Oh, it's pretty good. All right. Cell phone data. So you're aware then of this. But reports that came out just this week, I think it was Monday, I read about it. Reports out just this week confirm that the federal government, DHS, ICE, and the IRS in particular, are spending millions of your taxpayer dollars purchasing access to cell phone data. The CDC reportedly spent $420,000 on data access to track COVID super spreaders. And these are just the published agencies. The probability is very high that the Department of Justice also used this to track and prosecute J6 attendees. You have to know, guys, your phone and the precise location it broadcasts every couple of seconds is public record, protected by no less than three Supreme Court rulings. One of them in 2019, Carpenter v. United States. Many of us in this room have been subject to our techno overlord capricious and unconstitutional behavior. As a co-founder of the World Prayer Network with Dr. Garlow and Rosemary and my friend Mario Bromnick, I hosted more than 2 million views of my Facebook page in November and December 2020. It's where we put out the World Prayer Network to get started. I'm flying home from DC on November 4th, and they're like, let's try and stream it on the internet. Well, we did that. Louis Gohmert broke the server Sitel, or the Sitel server raid story on the World Prayer Network. We had, well, lots of people. I probably shouldn't be saying out loud now because I'm in Washington. But a few days after January 6th, Facebook then banned me from ever using any of its ad platforms. I never did a dollar on Facebook that was connected to World Prayer Network, but I lost my business's ability to serve my marketing clients because I could no longer permanent ban from Facebook for some dubious reasons. Eric Metaxas told me that in November, December, he couldn't even put my website in his Gmail account because Google would shut it down if he said a personal email with my URL in it. I was kicked off of Aweber before I sent a single email on their platform for sending hate speech. Okay, this was all about my URL that was broadcasting the World Prayer Network, that was broadcasting certain people. Okay? I work with one faith-based organization, a large C3 organization, and we sent out 110 million text message segments to targeted voters in the swing states with voter guides in 2020. We experienced severe rate limiting and deliverability issues from the major carriers, and we were forced to rebuild it on something different for 2022. Okay, the fact remains that if you're on the right, it's 3 to 4 times as hard for you to get your message out. And you've got to work harder, you've got to pay more, and you've got to not give up. That's the world that we live in. We can complain about it, or we can get busy winning again. But now, you know, unlike sort of like urban sprawl, cancel culture is reaching out past the right and it's cannibalizing its own. Those who historically share similar political sentiments are now targets of cancel culture if they refuse to surrender their free speech. Two great examples of this, author J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame and leading comedian Dave Chappelle were criticized for their allegedly transphobic stances. In Rawlings' case, it was a tweet. In Dave Chappelle's case, it was his Netflix special. Chappelle's case for me is a little more problematic because even in the medieval times when the feudal lords ruled with their iron fist, the court jester was still allowed to speak truth to power. We truly are in a dark age if we begin murdering comedians' careers. It's funny, but it's real. The comedians can't speak, we're in trouble. And we haven't even gotten to the almighty algorithm yet, you know, which can suppress search results, elevate selected content to the front of the line. Perpetual profiles are built on individuals and groups stored over long periods and used to measure your place in the intent hierarchy. That's an algorithm that tells them where you are along the pathway to acting, thinking, and believing certain things. What's your trajectory and estimated time of enlightenment? How many more memes do you need to see on Facebook before you are willing to go woke? Algorithms really are weapons of math destruction. Wah, wah, wah. I know Jim would appreciate that. He's got that sort of cheesy pastor humor. So we'll keep going with some cheesy pastor humor. I echo the words of our founding fathers. You'll know these. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all big tech companies are created evil, that they are endowed with their boards with certain unassailable rights. Among these are wokeism, censorship, and the pursuit of power. The foundational truths in corporate America. But all parodies aside, as cancel culture permeates our life, it's worth remembering this. The goal of communication is understanding, not agreement. We communicate with each other with words, with expressions, or digital tools to help us understand one another. Communication is the tool for negotiating human relationships. What happens when you find yourself with competing desires with your spouse? Who wins? The man, the spouse? Every man will say the wife wins, right? But you have to negotiate by communicating, not just telling your side of the story. You've got to talk, communicate, okay? When we don't communicate, relationships deteriorate. What's more, the freedom to speak is the freedom to think. Very few people have the training, the disposition, the time, the talent necessary to sit down and think through complex issues by themselves. We're communal by nature. Most people learn to think by talking about it. Secure and safe communication is necessary to sustain our ability as a culture to think. Okay, this is not just about shutting down your message. This is working into your very ability to be free and to have a brain. Okay, the problem is much greater than we may be aware. But cancel culture, in contrast, seduces us into believing that communication is about agreement, right? Speech, especially online, is highly regulated, and you're pressured into conforming with some capricious and ever-changing standard. When speech is required to agree with cultural norms, or else, communication has stopped and the battle has begun. And since thinking precedes the ability to communicate those thoughts, cancel culture is teaching us what to think and keeping us from learning how to think. Okay? So, I want to teach you all today how to think about the twin problems of cancel culture and secure communications. The first half of my talk illustrated 3 critical categories for understanding how tech censorship and thus free speech work. But they also articulate the structure that's underneath it. Okay, these are the structures I want to explain to you guys a little bit about. Number one, Hunter Biden's laptop. This is the hardware component of the tech stack and the free speech suppression. The second one, Facebook. This is a software component. And the third one, cell phone data. This is DSP, ISP. I will explain those terms to you in just a moment. Okay, so for the remainder of my time, I'm going to lay out these 3 basic technical components to messaging, communication online. And I hope to reduce some of the mystery and then maybe the associated terror for you. Understanding how something works helps us know how to interact effectively and then to counteract aggressively, both of which we can and we must do. So here's a graphic that shows how these 3 main components work together using the example of a cell phone. So this iPhone is the hardware physical material component. Okay, and it carries a variety of hardware-enabled features like a GPS acquisition and broadcast satellite, an antenna for cellular capturing and broadcasting. So your phone comes also with an operating system, which is software and allows you to interact. But then you load up other applications onto your phone, and that's the WhatsApp of the world and any of the other things that you have on your phone, right? That's a software layer. So the software layer runs on top of the hardware layer, and each one of those do something. Last piece of the puzzle is your data service provider, DSP, or internet service provider. Data service provider are your AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, Patriot Mobile, which is a repackaging of existing services, or your internet service provider, that's your home Wi-Fi internet network connections. So your hardware loads up a software app, and that software app does some stuff and it sends it via the data connection from your DSP ISPs, and then they relay that information down into your group text thread. Okay, that's your basic structure of the things that are going on inside of that. So this data service provider is one of the most troubling because it daily transmits and receives the trillions of bits of information that you willingly generate and broadcast to your friends, your family, your coworkers, and the NSA's massive data gathering project called Echelon. These three particular items work together to create, in the words of the late Steve Jobs, a magical and revolutionary experience. Okay, and so each of these areas also generates valuable personal consumer data, which are stored, analyzed, and used to influence you subconsciously. Big tech creates big data, which generate big profit. It's the data that makes them the money. So here are where some of the world's largest and most influential companies are in market cap valuation and where they fit into this communication grid. First one, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast. AT&T, Verizon are DSPs. Comcast is an ISP, internet service provider, market cap 540 billion. That's a little bit of coin. Meta, they were forced to get broken up after a lawsuit last year, direct result of Trump's lawsuit against BigTech. But they broke that up and called it Meta. They have WhatsApp as well and Instagram, Oculus, a bunch of stuff. They're 479 billion, they're software. Although Oculus, the 3D VR goggles, that's a little bit of hardware action. Twitter, software. This is current market cap, which is 50% less than it was about 3 months ago. Guys, we're almost there. Go woke, go broke. That's almost a thing. Apple, now we're playing with the big leagues here. Apple's #1 in market cap valuation, 2.45 trillion. Okay, they make hardware and software. Apple is essentially a hardware company. Okay, Microsoft, the original, the OG in the computer world, 1.94 trillion. They're hardware and software. And then Google, Alphabet, the last one, 1.49 trillion. They do hardware. They're into the Pixel phone or the Google phone. They got that out. They're primarily software, but they're also getting into the ISP business, the internet service provider with their Google Fiber service. So now that you have a grid for thinking about this, you can kind of see why they would want to get into that. And every step along the way, you generate data that you own that you can sell. So the more places you're connected, the more resources you have, and the more influence you can have. So now that we've understood thinking about this and interacting effectively, let's talk about effective interaction. Oh, this is final one, $6.9 trillion worth of valuation in these 5 companies. So effective interaction means that you can use this communication with understanding, okay? We can't just go live on a farm if we have all of the last speaker's stuff, which would be great, but go live on a farm and turn off all of our technology. Like, that's a possibility. That's retreating into a citadel. How do we engage and appreciate and use this stuff effectively? So first, you just have to know, I'm preaching to the choir probably today, but nothing, virtually nothing that you generate digitally and transmit via this system is 100% secure from being read and intercepted and then read. The real question is not, is it being intercepted? It's which third party is intercepting it. Okay, this is kind of a joke, but it's also not a joke. If you want to ensure that your instant messages are not being read by the US government, use WeChat. It's wholly owned by the Chinese Communist Party and it's used as a spying thing, and they're not letting the US in. And if you don't want the Chinese Communist Party to read your text messages, then use Facebook and WhatsApp, because it's owned by the US government and in partnership, and they don't let the Chinese in. Now, if you want any federal employee with a grudge against you for standing up with your parental rights to challenge school boards, then send a text message so everyone can read it. Text messaging on your carrier's normal platforms is the least secure way to communicate. I would just encourage you, unless it's a grocery list or a complaint about your kid, don't use text messages to talk to your friends about anything of importance. Use a secure messaging app. Okay, these messaging apps that boast end-to-end encryption, they're more secure than text messages, but they're not totally secure. Right? Many of these popular encrypted apps use the same encryption protocol called the Signal protocol. Signal has its own app, but it was originally an encryption and still is an encryption protocol. It's an encryption protocol, a foundation, and an application. So when you type in a Signal message, this is the basics of how Signal messages work, encryption work. I was talking to Kevin, so this is going to be like, big tablet, chief crayon version for him. But when you type in a Signal message and you hit send, what happens is that the hardware interacts with the software, the Signal, and it creates a string of nonsensical characters called an encryption. So the hardware encrypts, and then it creates a unique identifier that only comes from your phone. And then it gets sent, this encrypted nonsensical string gets sent via your DSP ISP to the other person that's receiving it. And they get that, they unpack it because they know your ID, and then it shows up on your screen. Okay, it's relatively secure. But what happens if your DSP ISP stops being willing to send your encrypted data? What then? Places like Iran shut down the national cell phone and internet services to keep people from communicating with one another on the outside world. What then? Well, now we're at the final point, counteracting these things aggressively. There's a little bit of offense in this defense day. Across the globe, there's a lot that's being done to counteract these systems, these three components. The easiest to develop is the software component. This is where you guys probably are engaging. There's lots of new free speech platforms popping up. Rumble, Truth Social, Bright Cove, Frank Speech. These are all examples, but they're just 1/3 of the problem. These are software components. What about DSP, ISP blackouts? Not just EMP, but literally turning off the switch. There's a kill switch in America for the internet. Do you guys know that? Like it's legit. You can just turn it off. I wouldn't want to work in that office. I'd be too tempted to be like, ugh. Sorry, stock market. Well, like Star Trek, space really is the final frontier here. Okay, internet companies like Musk's Starlink are investing billions of dollars to get internet up in the sky, into space. What these do is these companies bypass the existing data infrastructure, which primarily transmits your data through undersea cabling. Okay, the user receives the information wirelessly, but when it goes back to the ISP, they're all connected via underground cables that connect up continents. Okay, most of the world's internet communication passes between continents through massive underwater cabling. That's an underwater cabling ship there. Okay, and so if you're into this kind of thing, you may be in this room, then many people think this extensive data system is best described as the beast system from Revelation 13. Well, maybe you can understand why the beast is described in Revelation 13:1 as rising out of the sea. So all the data on the internet travels under the sea. But there's also, not just under the sea, but there's also nanosatellites that are being deployed by certain groups in preparation for anticipated global blackouts. Why nanosatellites? Look at the size of these things. Why nanosatellites? So they're harder to shoot down by the space weaponry being created by governments. Y'all, this isn't science fiction. It's one of the reasons why we have the 4th branch of the US military, Space Force. Space communication using satellite and nanosatellite technology is here. So I suggest, if you're a praying person, add your intercession time to these individuals who are building firewalls with nanosatellites in space. It sounds so crazy, but I know some of the guys and gals, they're doing it. So the last piece of pushback is on the hardware side of things. Phones are developing hardware, allowing them to create a mesh network. Have you guys heard of this phrase, mesh networks? You may have seen them on your new consumer Wi-Fi routers where you get 3 different routers and it broadcasts them and just connects to them all. I guess that's my cue to stop. So you can't learn anything about mesh networks, y'all. But phones are being created so that when they get close to one another, you can all communicate without the overhead DSP, ISP. So the last and most important thing to protect yourself against these invasive systems is worship the living God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The enemy's always wanted one thing, your worship. He couldn't get it from the Father in heaven. He couldn't get it from Jesus in the wilderness. And he's not going to get it from the church. When global government shut down our system and forced us to stay in, there were people that came out and said, no, we're going to worship. We're going to stand in front of these global powers, and we are going to firewall ourselves against this system and securely communicate with the Lord our God in unrestrained, extravagant worship. Thank you.